We talk about millennials, we talk about Gen Z, but rarely about the ones in between. The ones who didn't grow up fully online, but didn't stay offline either. The ones who remember a world where friendships were something you showed up for, not something that followed you everywhere. And if you're part of that in-between, you might remember something else. Not a dramatic ending, not a fight, not a clear moment where things broke. Just silence. A friend you used to see every day. Someone who knew your routines, your jokes, the version of you that existed in a very specific time. And then slowly, without any real decision, they were just gone from your life. No final conversation, no closure, no goodbye. And what's strange is, it didn't feel shocking when it happened. Felt normal, almost expected, like something you didn't question at the time. But years later, you think about it differently. You wonder how someone could be such a consistent part of your life, and then become a memory without a clear ending. You wonder why there was no moment of acknowledgement, no line that separated before and after. It's a quiet kind of mystery, because these weren't broken friendships. They didn't collapse under conflict. They didn't end with words that needed to be repaired. They just faded. And for a long time, no one really talked about that kind of ending. There wasn't a name for it. No cultural script to explain it. Just a shared, unspoken experience carried by people who grew up in a very specific moment in time. A moment where connection worked differently. Where distance meant something else. Where silence didn't always mean loss, but it often became it. And maybe that's why it's hard to explain now. Because in today's world, where everything is visible, where people don't just disappear without a trace, that kind of quiet fading feels almost unfamiliar. But for those who lived through it, it wasn't unusual at all. It was just how things went. They're often called Xennials. Not always officially, not always consistently defined. But for those who recognize the feeling, the label tends to make quiet sense. Born somewhere between the late 1970s and the mid-1980s, they don't sit comfortably at either end of the generational spectrum. Too young to fully belong to Generation X. Slightly too early to feel completely shaped by the millennial experience. Instead, they exist in between. Not as an overlap, but as a transition. They remember childhood as something physical and present. A time when communication had weight to it. When a phone call meant being in one place at one time. When friendships were built through shared spaces, schools, neighborhoods, routines that repeated day after day. And yet, they also stepped into adulthood just as the world began to shift. Slowly at first. The introduction of the internet, the unfamiliar sound of a dial-up connection, the first email addresses that felt more experimental than essential. Then, gradually, the acceleration, text messages, social platforms, constant access. They didn't grow up with it, but they adapted to it. Which means their memories are split across two different rhythms of life. One where connection required effort, timing, and presence. And another where connection became instant, continuous, and almost effortless. They learned to write notes by hand, and later to compress thoughts into short messages on a screen. They experienced waiting, and then unlearned it. And because of that, their identity doesn't feel fixed in one era. Feels layered. There's a quiet understanding that comes from remembering both worlds. Not as an abstract idea, but as something lived. Something felt in the way relationships formed, and the way they slowly changed. So when you place yourself in that space, not fully one, not fully the other, it doesn't feel like being undefined. It feels like recognizing a very specific position in time. A generation that didn't just witness the shift, but carried it. If you go back far enough, the rhythm of everyday life feels noticeably slower. A house with a single landline phone usually placed in a shared space. The quiet awareness that if it rang, everyone could hear it. Conversations weren't private by default. They were moments you stepped into, often with someone nearby, half listening without meaning to. And if you were waiting for a call, you felt it. Not as a notification, but as a kind of presence in the background. Time moved around it. You stayed close. You checked the clock more often than usual. Outside, afternoons stretched longer than they seemed to. Bikes left leaning against walls. Doors closing behind you without much explanation. You didn't need to announce where you were going, only that you'd be back before it got dark. And somehow that was enough. Friendships lived in those spaces, side by side, repeated, unplanned, consistent. In classrooms, communication was quieter, but more deliberate. Folded pieces of paper passed between desks, handwritten notes carrying jokes, questions, fragments of thought that only made sense in that moment. You could hold them, reread them, keep them tucked away without fully knowing why. And then there were the small, almost invisible sounds that filled the background of that time. The steady hum of a television left on in another room. The soft click of a cassette sliding into place. The mechanical rhythm of buttons being pressed, rewound, replayed. Even silence had texture. Evenings without constant input, where nothing demanded your attention. You sat with your thoughts more often, not because you chose to, but because there wasn't always something there to interrupt them. And then, gradually, something shifted. At first, it arrived as a kind of curiosity. A computer in the corner of a room. A process that felt more like preparation than use, turning it on, waiting, listening. And then that sound. The unmistakable sequence of tones from a dial-up connection, signaling entry into something new, but not yet familiar. The internet wasn't always there. It was something you accessed, briefly. Chat rooms that opened small windows into other lives. Conversations with people you didn't fully know, in spaces that felt both distant and immediate at the same time. But even then, there were limits. Time constraints. Shared phone lines. The quiet understanding that this connection would end, and soon. So you logged off. And when you did, everything returned to how it was before. The same rooms. The same routines. The same physical presence of the world around you. It wasn't a complete transformation. Not yet. It was something in between. A life still grounded in physical reality. Slowly brushing up against something more fluid, more continuous. And without realizing it, you were learning how to move between both. If you look at how relationships were maintained during that time, there's a quiet pattern that begins to emerge. Before social media, before constant visibility, connection depended on something much simpler and much more fragile. Proximity, timing, and effort. Researchers who study communication patterns often note that, in pre-digital environments, friendships were largely sustained by shared routines, school, neighborhoods, workplaces. When those routines changed, the connection didn't always break. It just lost its structure. And without that structure, something subtle would happen. The friendship wouldn't end in a clear, defined way. There was no moment where both people acknowledged a shift. Instead, contact became less frequent. Calls were delayed. Plans became harder to coordinate. And over time, silence started to fill the gaps where interaction used to be. Not as a decision, but as a drift. There's also the question of memory, how relationships are held in place over time. Today, conversations are stored, visible, retrievable. Messages remain. Photos resurface. There's a kind of digital permanence that keeps people present, even when interaction fades. But back then, that permanence didn't exist in the same way. If you didn't write something down, if you didn't keep a physical reminder, most interactions simply passed. They lived in memory, and memory has a different quality to it. It softens, it reshapes, it lets things settle without demanding resolution. So when a friendship began to fade, there was nothing pulling it back into focus. No notifications, no reminders, no quiet reappearances in a feed. Just distance, doing what it naturally does. From a psychological perspective, this created a different kind of expectation around relationships. Not necessarily weaker, but less defined at the edges. Endings didn't always need explanation, because there wasn't a system insisting that they be acknowledged. And maybe that's why, at the time, it didn't feel unusual. It felt consistent with the way life was structured. You moved, they moved, schedules changed, environments shifted, and somewhere in that transition, the connection loosened, until it was no longer part of your daily world. Not lost in a dramatic sense, just no longer active. And without a record of when it changed or how it changed, it becomes difficult to point to a single moment and say, that's where it ended. What begins to make more sense over time is how much the environment itself shaped what connection was supposed to feel like. Because back then, communication wasn't constant. It wasn't something that followed you everywhere, quietly running in the background of your day. It was something you stepped into, and just as easily stepped out of. You called someone when you could. You met when your schedules aligned. And in between those moments, there were gaps, natural, expected gaps where nothing was exchanged at all. And those gaps didn't immediately raise questions. They didn't suggest distance in the emotional sense. They simply reflected distance in the physical one. If someone moved away or changed routines or entered a different phase of life, silence often followed. Not because the connection had been intentionally withdrawn, but because the pathways to maintain it were no longer as available. You couldn't just reach out instantly. You couldn't maintain a low-level presence in someone's life without effort. Every interaction required a decision, a moment of attention, a kind of alignment that wasn't always easy to recreate. So the rhythm of relationships became slower. A letter that took days, sometimes weeks. A phone call that had to be planned or at least timed carefully. A visit that depended on geography, not just intention. And in that slower rhythm, something subtle took shape. Connection became tied to presence. Not just emotional presence, but physical and situational presence. Being in the same place at the same time, sharing the same environment, that was what kept a relationship active. When that presence disappeared, the connection didn't always translate into a new form. It didn't automatically adapt. Sometimes it simply paused, and then quietly faded. Not as a rejection, but as an absence of conditions. Over time, this creates a certain kind of emotional habit. An understanding, often unspoken, that silence is not always meaningful in itself. That it doesn't always need to be interpreted, questioned, or resolved. It just exists. And because of that, many people from that era learned not to chase every gap. Not to fill every silence with explanation. Not to demand continuity where the environment itself made continuity difficult. Which is why, years later, when they look back at those friendships, the feeling is often less about something ending, and more about something that slowly lost its place. Over time, these conditions don't just shape how people connect, they shape how people let go. For many Xennials, the idea of a clear ending in a friendship was never something that felt necessary. Not because the connection lacked meaning, but because it was never built around constant reinforcement in the first place. When circumstances changed, when routines shifted, when distance quietly entered the picture, there wasn't always an instinct to stop and define what was happening. There was no urgent need to ask, "Are we still close?" No expectation that every change required a conversation. Instead, there was a kind of quiet acceptance. Messages became less frequent. Meetings became occasional. And eventually, the connection moved out of the present without ever being formally closed. Not rejected, just no longer active in the same way. And within that pattern, certain tendencies began to take shape. A comfort with independence. An ability to hold memories without needing to revisit them constantly. A kind of emotional self-containment that didn't rely on ongoing validation. It wasn't about detachment. It was about adaptation. Because when you grow up in an environment where connection depends on timing and proximity, you also learn, often without realizing it, that not everything can be maintained indefinitely. So you don't hold on in the same way. You allow space. You allow distance. And sometimes you allow things to end without naming the ending at all. What's important is that, at the time, this didn't always feel like loss. It didn't carry the same weight that it might today. There was no constant visibility reminding you of what had changed. No steady stream of updates keeping someone partially present in your life. There was just a gradual shift. And within that shift, silence became something familiar. Not uncomfortable, not alarming, just part of the natural rhythm of relationships. So when a friendship faded, it didn't always feel like something had gone wrong. Felt like something had simply run its course. And only much later, with distance and reflection, does that pattern begin to stand out. Not as a mistake, but as a very specific way of relating to people, one that was shaped quietly over time by the world you were living in. As those years unfolded, the wider world was changing too. sometimes gradually, sometimes all at once. There was a period, especially in the late 90s, that carried a certain lightness to it, a sense of openness. The future felt expansive, even if it wasn't fully defined. For many, life was still anchored in local circles, school friends, early jobs, familiar places that gave relationships a kind of steady continuity. And then, the tone shifted. Global events introduced a different kind of awareness, a quiet uncertainty that settled into everyday life. Not always spoken about directly, but felt in the background, in conversations, in decisions, in the way people began to think about stability, work, and the future. Around the same time, the internet was no longer just an occasional experience. It was becoming part of daily life. Still not as seamless or constant as it is now, but present enough to begin reshaping how people interacted, how they searched for opportunities, how they imagined their place in the world. And with that came movement. People started leaving the places they had grown up in, moving to different cities for education, for work, for something that felt just slightly out of reach if they stayed where they were. Careers became less linear, more exploratory. Life paths stretched outward instead of staying close. And naturally, relationships stretched with them. But unlike today, there weren't many tools to hold those connections in place once distance increased. There were no ongoing updates, no passive ways of staying involved in each other's lives. If you didn't actively reach out, if you didn't make the effort to call or visit, the connection didn't quietly continue in the background. Paused. And over time, it often faded. Not because the relationship lacked value, but because the conditions required to sustain it had changed. In that sense, many friendships were shaped not just by personal choices, but by the structure of the world at the time. A world where mobility was increasing, but connection hadn't yet caught up to it. Where people could move forward quickly, but relationships didn't always have the same ability to follow. So the drifting wasn't always intentional. It was often situational, a byproduct of growing up in a moment where life was expanding outward, faster than the systems that kept people connected. And within that expansion, many connections were simply left behind, not forgotten, not erased, just no longer carried into the next phase. And maybe, as you sit with this, someone comes to mind. Not someone you lost in a dramatic way, not someone tied to a specific ending, just someone who was there, and then gradually wasn't. A name you haven't said in a while. A version of your life that only exists with them in it. And if you notice that feeling, there's no need to turn it into regret. No need to search for a moment that explains everything, or a reason that makes it feel complete. Because for many, there wasn't a single moment. There was just time moving forward, circumstances shifting, life quietly rearranging itself. And within that movement, some connections didn't break. They simply settled into the past. There's a kind of peace in recognizing that, in understanding that not every meaningful relationship is meant to have a defined ending, that some were shaped by a world where presence mattered more than permanence. And when that presence changed, the relationship followed, not as a failure, not as something unfinished, but as something that belonged fully to a certain time. And maybe that realization doesn't close the story in a traditional way, but it softens it. It allows you to hold those memories without needing to resolve them, to see them as part of how you learned to connect and how you learned quietly to let go. And if this feeling seems familiar, there are other experiences like this shaped by being in between. Moments that don't quite fit into clear definitions, but still leave a lasting imprint. The kind we don't always talk about,